Open up my eyes in wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me.
Well, hey, good evening, church family, and welcome to our first Monday's webinar of 2021. Really excited to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we kick off our first Monday's webinar with a special guest with us. So for those of you who are new to these webinars, really what we're trying to do is to have a look at some practical implications of living faithfully as a Christian and distinctly as a Christian, particularly in these challenging circumstances. So we kicked this off last year thinking that the challenging circumstances would be kind of a shorter period of time. Now it's carried on. It's a lot still to talk about how to live faithfully in these times. So for today, for our February 1st Monday's webinar, we're going to be talking about the subject of a Christian view of finances. So as most of you will know, kind of spoke about that yesterday in the first of our Rule of Life series. And really just excited tonight to have somebody with us who's going to help us navigate some of the practical aspects of that. For example, to help us think through just the economy in South Africa at the moment, why it is the way it is, what we can expect for the rest of this year, and just really some advice for us as individuals, as families and churches, how to just live faithfully in these particularly difficult economic times. So that subject is for sure not my forte, and so that's why tonight we brought in the big guns, and so I'm very excited to introduce to you Gary Tamlin. So Gary is the treasurer. How's it, Gary? Good evening to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Gary is the treasurer of the Discovery Group, having previously worked as the deputy treasurer at Nedbank. He's also an elder at Honey Ridge Baptist Church, chairs the finance committee there as well. So Justin and Lee from Rosebank knew Gary really well. And so really confident we have just the right people talking to us tonight in Gary. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for spending some time with us.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Thank you for having me, and really appreciate the invitation. So trust I can add some value.
Yeah. So some of you at Rosebank might recognize Gary. Gary, you've spoken at Rosebank before, right? It was a couple of years ago. You spoke at the church?
Yes, I gave a testimony a couple of years ago, and we are not strangers to Rosebank, and know many of the folk there. And so, yeah, just looking forward to being able to share a little bit, hopefully, that can try and encourage the church, encourage the folk, and just remind us, in the midst of a very changing world around us, that God hasn't changed, and that we can honor him even in a crisis, or maybe I should say especially in a crisis.
Right. Sounds great. Well, I'm going to pray for us, and I'm going to just hand right over to Gary. Oh, actually, probably what I should do is, before I pray and hand over to Gary, is just kind of, for those of you new for our webinars, just a little bit of info on how this works. So Gary's going to kind of chat to us for about 25, 30 minutes or so. And then there's time for Q&A. And that's a really important part of this webinar, is just the opportunity for you to ask questions. So finance-related questions to Gary. So you can do that just in the chat forum. So if you're watching on Go Live, you can use the chat there. Post your questions. You're watching on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you're watching this, just use the comment section to post your questions, and we'll gather those in the background. And then when Gary's finished presenting, then I'll go through those questions with Gary. So get them ready, and feel free to just send them at any point in the presentation. All right, well, let's pray. I'm going to hand over to you, Gary. God, thank you for this time tonight. And we know, Lord Jesus, you spoke so much about money and finances and the impact on our hearts and our lives. the challenges that it poses. You know us, you made us, you understand the particular pressure we're under, you understand our anxiety, our worries, our misplaced desires. You know it all. And you carried all of those burdens on the cross. And so, Lord Jesus, we pray tonight that you would speak to us. So through Gary and just through our interaction afterwards as well, just help us just come out of tonight with practical ways, real ways that we can live faithfully as your followers, Lord Jesus, distinctly in these times. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, Gary, over to you. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, good evening, everybody. So our focus tonight is, as Richard has shared, is really just to talk about finances from a Christian perspective and our view on finances. I certainly would like to talk about perhaps the last 18 months and perhaps the next 18 months. Pretty hard in 30 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. I'd like to also just maybe make some practical suggestions to you as well. Forgive me for some terminology if you are not involved in finances. I will try and keep it at a level that everyone can at least understand the content in terms of concepts. But let's go. So let's start off by having a look at South Africa. And dare I suggest that we South Africans suffer from tending to think that we're the only country in the world that has challenges and that things are not perfect. And I just want to illustrate to you tonight, in a sense, a South African view on the economy, and then perhaps a global view on the global economy, and then just talk about some practical things in application to individuals and perhaps even the church as well if we have time. So let's kick off and start off with interest rates. If you are retired and invest your money and live off your investments or live off a living annuity, you'll know that interest rates have come down quite dramatically. And the rate that the Reserve Bank charges the banks has come down 3%. And for many of you who are investing, and retired folk tend to invest 1 year and longer, you would have found that your interest rates in some areas have dropped as much as 5%. That would have had a big impact on you. And for some of you, that would be creating some hardship as well. Secondly, just to say to you, inflation, which really measures how much goods, a basket of goods, and you might agree or disagree on that basket, but inflation has been hovering around 3%, which again is at least 2%, maybe a bit more, off from where it typically hovers around. And so in theory, things are costing less, things are not going up as much as they were. And then another big factor in our economy is the rand dollar. And the reason it's a big factor is because we import a lot of things, and one of the primary things we pay for in dollars is oil, which results in a petrol price, which results in the cost of goods being moved around and being influenced by it. So a big issue. And in the last 18 months, we've seen the rand dollar spike up well above 17, and we've seen it come well down to about 14.50, somewhere around there. And so we're currently seeing a rand slightly stronger. I'm going to make a comment to you on this, and I trust it'll be helpful. John Keynes from RMB wrote a very good article. It is online, where he shows that about 80% of the weakness of the rand above what they call the parity level. So if you compare two currencies, any two currencies globally, and if you compare their inflation rates over a 20-year period, you get what's called a parity value. And so if you compare America's inflation and South Africa's inflation, bar a few spikes up and down, the rand should be at about 13.85, somewhere around there. You might have read about the McDonald's index, and that's just a humorous way of seeing what the same hamburger costs in countries throughout the world. But in reality, using a much more scientific approach, an actuarial approach, the rand should be about 13.85 to the dollar. $1 costs 13.85. Anything above that, about 80% of that, has got nothing to do with us as a country and has everything to do with us as an emerging market, as a growing market, and a market that's not fully established, and about 20% is linked to us. The current strength in the rand is predominantly emerging market strength of the dollar weakening. So lest we claim fame for it or think that we're doing something right, we're benefiting from the other side of a weak dollar at the moment. And then if you look at how the country is growing, which is called your gross domestic product or your GDP, and if they measure it at the factory where it comes out the factories, it's called PPI, Producer Price Index. That's looking pretty awful, been negative through the crisis and predicted to start to be positive. But we don't grow enough under normal circumstances, let alone during the last 18 months when we had hit 9 months of a very shaky economy. So growth is looking quite awful. And then unemployment, again, something that we struggle with as a country in terms of large numbers of people being unemployed. And certainly it has been exacerbated by, during the lockdown now, a number of companies early retiring those that are close to pension. Some of you would have experiencing reduced work weeks. Some of you might have been asked by your companies to take reduced salaries. Some of you might have been asked by your companies to sacrifice pension contributions or, dare I suggest, even to cut back your medical aid plan. The bottom line is it's gone the wrong way, and many of you will be feeling the brunt of that consequence of the economy not firing. Bear in mind, there's a number of economic activities that are not happening right now, and some of them are surprising. I certainly have been surprised. But for example, if you're a travel agent, you won't be very busy, particularly if it's with foreign tourists. If you're in the restaurant business, catering businesses, all those things are very quiet. And even certain things like medical practices. I was chatting to somebody in the last couple of weeks who is a medical doctor and who has a practice in our area, and she was telling me that she never had a flu season this year. And while that might sound like a good thing to you and me, it basically caused her not to get a significant amount of traffic through her doors, and resulted in her practice not being very busy, and the consequences of that. So unemployment, big problem, even exacerbated. You would have heard lots of commentary and comments that certain things under the lockdown, the non-sale of alcohol has affected a lot of industries. Obviously, you can't travel. And then don't forget, with a lot of us working from home, I'm not sure about you, but I've hardly used any petrol in the last while. And that also has a knock-on effect. And then what's called the stock exchange or the equity markets. A share price is typically, if I was to give it to you very simply in a one-liner, a share price is usually your net asset value plus implied forward earnings, what you think that company is going to earn, and it gives you a multiple of what that share should be worth. And if we were all standing around a braai having a chat, I think we'd all be in agreement that there's not a lot of excitement or a lot of positiveness in terms of how companies are going to grow in the next while. And certainly the last 9 months, many of them have contracted as opposed to have grown, and therefore their share prices, while they're not down a lot, they're certainly not going anywhere. And then there's the bond market. And the bond market, the easiest way to think of that is a market where government or government entities go and borrow. In theory, they are risk-free, but we know that's not totally true. And so government bond markets, the rates have actually gone up. And the reason they've gone up is because governments have got themselves into more debt, including the South African government. And so governments have had to borrow large sums of money to subsidize people who couldn't go to work and who have been struggling. And so the consequence of that, if the government owes more money, they is deemed a higher risk, and therefore they need to pay a higher interest rate to the investors that fund those governments. Petrol price, something we all get to experience most of the time in one way or another. Oil price, because we're all not going to work, and it's not just in South Africa, petrol price is a consequence of a lower oil price, which is very positive, but we don't get to enjoy it that much. And then the consequence of all these things is that tax revenue or tax collection, i.e. the money that the government collects to run the government, to run the country, is down. I actually heard today that it's not down as much as they thought it was going to be. But a simple thing like alcohol, where a lot of people spend a lot of money, things like travel, things like restaurants, things like the fuel levy has a big tax component. All those tax amounts are not going into the fiscus at the moment. And then we can throw Eskom into the discussion. If you haven't had a load shedding for the last week, you've been fortunate. But that's a reality that we have in terms of capacity of electricity that affects business and outputs. And then the the kind of thing that kind of puts all these factors together and tells the investment community in the world what we're like as an investment opportunity are the rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and the like. And South Africa has been on the wrong side of downgrades to their ratings in the last while. And so we are deemed as a higher risk, and we have probably just cemented that by having to borrow more money during this lockdown. Lest you think that South Africa is full of doom and gloom, can I suggest to you, even prior to the lockdown, the world is not in a good place. Probably the best indicator I could think of that would give you an idea on how bad things are, and this might surprise you, but in 23 countries in the world, there are negative interest rates. In other words, if you go and put money with a bank, you don't earn interest, you pay interest. That's if you place money on deposit. Most of them are in Europe. You'd be surprised to see the list that's there, but 23 countries have negative interest rates. This last week, I saw one of the banks in Europe advertising a 20-year home loan to private individuals at a 0 rate. Now, you might think, well, how do they make money? Well, 0 is more than a negative rate. So the reality is that the world has its own problems, and countries throughout the world are also struggling economically. Inflation globally, the truth be told, I actually don't know of any country that's struggling from high inflation rates, and I would suggest the opposite. I think they're all scared of balance sheet deflation. They're scared that our assets are going to suddenly start losing value globally, might be overpriced, but inflation is not an issue at the moment. And then if you start looking at the different currencies, and I'm being very high level here, but the US currency, the dollar, very weak off the back of all their political woes and storming the capital and all the other things you might have seen on TV. The UK struggling with a Brexit strategy that Ireland and Scotland are not 100% committed to. Europe itself is fragmented in terms of its strategy. And so in the midst of all those changes, you've got a situation where the economies are relatively weak. They're not growing. Interest rates are low, many of them negative, as I've said. And then compounded on that is there's a lot of political uncertainty. We had Theresa May in the UK, who was very stable, and now there's a Boris Johnson. But you look into Germany as well, there's change coming there. And these were significant cornerstones in terms of the European and the Euro sort of economy. If you look at growth overseas, it's all but nothing. I read an article this week saying that the USA had experienced a negative growth period. Only a handful of times has it experienced it since World War II. I think 2008 crisis was the last time. But the American economy is also shrinking or going backwards from a growth perspective. Overseas markets are much more efficient from a labor point of view. They are less unionized in the main, and they can hire and fire a lot easier. And so the fluctuation in terms of employment, there's a huge reduction in jobs. It blows hot and cold in America. If you see the numbers, they're often on TV. But unemployment becoming more globally problematic than it has been. Equity markets had a really good run, and a lot of it off a handful of shares. In other words, it's not their whole stock exchange, but realistically, the implied forward earnings are a concern to everybody. No one sits and thinks, well, these companies are all going to flourish, and instead of putting my money with a bank, I'm going to stick it on the JSE because the JSE is going to do its 11 or 15 or 18% like it did in years past. Global equity markets, unless you have got on exactly the right stocks, you would have found that they've been very flat to sideways with the odd bit of exuberance here and there. Bond markets, globally, bond markets have been under pressure because globally all the banks are digging into either their reserves or into debt in order to fund the COVID expenses. And bear in mind, we're a country of 60 million. America's got 360 million. You get to China where it's over 1 billion, India over 1 billion. Their numbers make ours look mild. Obviously, oil, they have the benefit of that. Bear in mind, America produces a lot of its own oil, and so the slowdown there is having a very similar effect on oil and gas. And you would have heard as well that tax revenue collections are also a big issue with then incurring more and more debt, spending more money, and bringing in less money, and rating agencies reflect all of that. And the gap between South Africa's rating and first world countries, for example, has not grown significantly because those other countries are also under review. The positive side is people can still come and invest here and earn 4 or 5%, whereas in America and these other countries, they're earning fractions of percentages. And so we are still attractive to a point. And for example, in our bond market, we saw $1 billion, about 17 billion rand, come in a couple of weeks ago. It just illustrates that we're not an island. Okay, moving along. So what kind of painted that picture as quickly as I could. So what now for the next 18 months? I think I've kind of painted the picture that economically everybody's in a mess. Overspent, unemployment is high, there's no growth, there's low interest rates, there's a lot of political uncertainty. And so for us as a Christian people, as Rosebank Church, I really want to challenge us. If you allow yourself to get caught up in the emotion and watch TV, some are saying that this will all be over in September, we'll all be vaccinated and we can go back to normal. Book your holiday now. Some are suggesting, no, it'll be 2022. And yes, the vaccine's coming. We saw pictures of it landing the other night, I think last night. My view, I actually am a director of a medical company as well, and my view is that we will all receive that vaccination in the next nine months or so. I think Professor Karim put it very appropriately by saying that assumes we are all vaccinated and the virus doesn't mutate, and that we don't have to face a third wave in winter. And there's huge challenges that go with us in terms of getting to the population in South Africa that perhaps aren't in the towns. Just to illustrate how dangerous it is if we have a small number of people who aren't vaccinated, and I know some of you will be sitting there saying, I don't plan on taking the vaccination, but the investigation to the Durban Matric Rage week that took place in November, December, I think it was, they've actually brought it down. Out of the 1,000 people that were there, and a large percentage of them went home sick, it actually started with 2 people who went to that event knowing that they were sick. That's what the investigation has brought down, and you will know those people are now deemed as super spreaders, and it's a risk we run that if you leave any stone unturned, that 1 or 2 people can allow this to develop again. So what can we do with what we know and what we don't know? We know that things are hard. I have no doubt in the congregation, just like at Honey Ridge where we attend, that we have a combination of retrenchments, early retirements. We have about 42 families that are living right on the edge at the moment that we've had to help. I thought I'd just put a brief list together of things for you as individuals, appreciating that some of you will be fine financially, and thank God for that. And I would suggest to you that you have a role in this too. Some of you will be really struggling. Perhaps a pensioner whose interest was fine when they were earning 7 or 8%. Now they're earning 4% or 4.5%, and suddenly their monthly income is down by half. Or perhaps somebody who's a travel consultant or works in a restaurant or is in a profession where perhaps they're not getting the opportunity to work and produce an income. And so forgive me if some of these things apply to you and some don't. I've had to shoot quite wide. But I want to just kick off by saying to you, just as a Christian, God hasn't changed. And I really want to encourage you to see what many would call this crisis as an opportunity and not a threat. I want to encourage you to stop being reactive, stop being defensive, and to embrace it. Embrace the fact that we are here, embrace the fact that God wasn't surprised, and embrace the fact that for now, God has allowed this thing in our lives, and that we must live to his glory to the best we can, exercise his principles as opportunity arises for us, and glorify him. And stop trying to ask him to take it away. Stop trying to ask it to go away. Stop trying to think it away, and just calm down and live out our Christian lives in a sense, accepting it's a level of normality for now. When it's gone away, that's fine. But I think we spend a lot of energy talking about how to get rid of it, how to avoid it, how to change it. And I'm certainly not in the camp that just suggests that she shouldn't wear a mask. I'm totally in the camp of wearing a mask and being careful and all those things. But I'm talking about your mindset that I really want to encourage you. I want to say to you that if you're struggling financially, God can use this to teach you the joy of trials. James 1, go and have a look at it. If you are fine financially, God can use you to bless somebody else and to teach you faith in giving more than you have given in the past. If you're retired and your interest has gone down, God can teach you, even in your later years, to place your faith in Him and trust Him in this situation. And really, what I'm saying to you, if the back of a verse like Romans 8:28 is, if you're aligned to God's purposes, ask yourself, where do I fit in? What should I be doing to please God in this situation? That's your calling at the moment. We'll come back to that. So some practical suggestions. First of all, to you pensioners that invest your hard-saved money over the years, can I say to you, please don't go and invest your money for a long period of time now. Interest rates are at 30-year lows in this country, and if you were to go and take a 5-year investment to earn an extra 1% in a year's time, it's quite likely you're going to be very bitter about it. My inclination would be to say to you, and I'm being very careful not to give financial advice without doing all the right things that you do when you do that, but just to say to you, please get good advice and accept that we are at a very low point in interest rates in South Africa and globally, and be careful not to lock yourself in at the bottom, and when rates go up that you don't benefit from it. So that'd be the first thing. Secondly, if you have a job, be flexible, protect that job, work hard, honor God by working at that faithfully, and understand that your employer has probably got their own challenges too in terms of cash flow and all the things that go with that. The obvious one, don't take on any debt that you don't have to. If at all possible, keep paying down debt if you can. Debt doesn't just disappear, and there's no certainty as to where we're going to go in terms of the economy for a while now, and I'd encourage you to avoid debt where possible and to keep it as low as possible. And then a bit of a sensitive one, but one that I've had to use just in the Honey Rich context with people. But ask yourself if every purchase that you come up with is a need or a want. And can I push some buttons here? DSTV is not a need. Aircon, running the aircon, if you have it in the house that you bought and it was there, is not a need. Magazines are not a need. If you battle with this, find a friend, an honest friend, and ask them to help you discern. But there are many things in our life that our society has labeled needs and entitlements. And if you need to cut back, I would encourage you to consider what are needs and wants, and to be careful going forward with that. Then something very close to my heart, and we've experienced this as well. The last thing you must ever cancel when you're struggling financially is your medical aid. If you need to downgrade the plan to a hospital plan, perhaps that's an option. But in a medical crisis like we're in, the last thing you need is to have to be reliant with no medical aid, and either putting a burden on your family or having to go to a government hospital, which can be very challenging at times. So I really would encourage you to consider that. Other things just to put out there, and again, I'm talking very much to those who are struggling. If you do have debt, there's a general acceptance that things are difficult. And I would encourage you to consider going and ask for delayed payments with people. They are much more accommodating than they were. If you have a pension that you pay every month or a retirement annuity that you pay in, again, if things are tough, you can approach these various insurance companies and you can ask for a payment holiday without jeopardizing your policy. Please don't go and dip into your pension unless you absolutely have to, and get financial advice. Today's actions are often tomorrow's consequences. And then just to say to you, stop entertaining yourself with the things that cost money and look to do things that are simple again. Try and find joy and pleasure in things that you don't have to buy and pay for, and get fulfillment in those things. I really would encourage you to look at all the obvious things. If you're working from home all the time, do you really need a security company that costs you a couple of $100 a month? Don't laugh at this, but I had someone in our church who was struggling financially, and when I sat them down, the wife said to me, he waters the garden every afternoon, and our water and lights bill is R1,000 a month. In their context, that was a problem. Stop watering the garden. It'll be fine. I'm sure some of you are sitting there. If I say this, you'll tell me that your parents used to tell me, my mom and dad did, switch off the lights when you're not in a room. But the obvious things, button down the hatches and try and keep the obvious expenses as low as possible. For those of you that are financially fine at the moment and perhaps are looking at things and saying, wow, interest rates are low, it's a great opportunity to change homes or change cars, I would really urge you to be careful. Perhaps it is the right time for you to make a change like that, but be very, very careful. Things can change very quickly. And if you understand the term gearing, where you take on debt, that means that every month when you get your salary, a large percentage of it goes to paying off debt. It's called debt to disposable income ratio. Avoid it. Avoid more debt at the moment. Live with what you've got. And then how am I doing for time? Just check with the ladies. I think I've got a couple of minutes. And then perhaps just to challenge you from a church perspective, there's no more important time for the church to be active now. And so I really would encourage you as Christians not to neglect your giving to the church, to the poor, to whoever God lays on your heart, but the importance to give, the importance to prioritize aligning yourself to God's purposes are really important. I'm just going to make a couple of comments in closing. At this time, in this country, at this time, we must be the church. We must be the bride of Christ to the lost. We must show our faith to God by the way we live, how we deal on our money, the fact that we don't stop tithing suddenly when things are hard, that perhaps I give up DSTV and perhaps I give up my magazines and perhaps I give up something else, but I keep giving to the Lord's work and to those that are poor around me. The other thing I would say to you is there's no better time from a Christian standpoint but to serve each other. Actually to love and to serve each other at this time is just so biblical principled. Care for your fellow Christian family as they struggle. Just a quick testimony from a Honey Ridge point of view. In our budget every year, we put aside about $2,000 a month, which we give to our pastors at their discretion to be able to help families who have the odd hiccup. And it's often used for food vouchers or a doctor's appointment or something like that. And we always say to them, if you need more, just ask. This last year, we decided, 2019, when we went into lockdown, we decided in about June that we would establish a care fund to help people in the church, and it would go both ways. You could give to it, and you could apply to it as a church, someone who was made Honey Ridge their home. Our testimony is that people have given over $500,000 to the care fund, and that we have supported 42 families with food and various other means, strictly controlled and done in a godly manner, and continue to look after, I think, 38 families at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. But there's an example of people saying, I want to give more, how do I give? And the church playing a role. Again, to just share with you, Honey Ridge finished the year on budget. And that's just such a blessing to us and a credit to people's faithfulness and trusting the Lord. So I really want to challenge you, those of you who are struggling financially, those who are fine financially, be the church. Go and look what will please God at this time. God is in control. He wasn't surprised by this thing. Don't waste a good crisis. Trust, show, live out your faith. You would have heard Romans 8:28 preached from your pulpit many times, but I just want to highlight one part of it to you. We know the verse says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. What's God's purpose for you? The first thing out of that verse is to love him. And I'd encourage you, no matter how things are going, love God. Go and find out what it is to love God and love him. And then seek his purposes however he's blessed you, whether it's with trials and temptations, whether it's with a surplus of money. But find out what pleases God. And I believe you would be a testimony to us and you would glorify God. Thank you, Richard.
Well, Gary, thank you. Thank you so much. Gave us a lot of info there about currently what's happening and then really brought it down to some practical help for us. So thank you. I've got a couple of questions for you. I think I'll just start with perhaps some quick hitters before we get to some more kind of philosophical ones. So do you see any change in our sort of economy as a country with the vaccines? So do you think the coming of the vaccines brings hope from an economic perspective?
So, Richard, it's a great question. And as I said to you, I'm involved in a medical company. So I think the vaccine will take a little while to get going, and then I think it'll come at us really fast. And I think the consequence of that economically is that I think the economically active people, and I know it's selfish to say that, but in a sense, I'm talking to the topic here. I do think by September we will be economically more active, but I also think that there are some things that are going to recover very quickly, and some things that are going to take time. And so there are things that, for example, travel, which it depends whether they open it up. South Africa is pretty much on the bad list at the moment, just about everywhere, because of our virus having mutated a little bit. So my personal view is once we get through September, we've probably got 18 months for the economy to get back to being stable, and then probably another 18 months to recover. That would be my view. And so that's why I say it's not over yet. And Richard, don't miss this. The mutation of the virus can bring complexities, and we can also face further frustrations next winter. The talk by Professor Karim, who I have enormous respect for, is that this could be a seasonal thing for us in many countries.
Okay. Do you see the interest rate changing at all this year?
Okay, so the Reserve Bank, our dear governor, who I respect enormously, Lesetja, his view at the moment is that the next move on interest rates, and they review them every 2 months formally, is that we're going to have 2 increases of 0.25% based on the look-through on inflation. Reuters, which is a news agency, their poll of 21 economists this last 10 days ago, so 17 of them suggest that interest rates should still go down another 0.25%. So it is a little bit of a guess. My view would be interest rates will be flat, and probably from about September, October, as the economy starts to recover, oil price will go up, inflation will increase, and they'll increase our interest rates. That's but in 0.25%, nothing dramatic.
Okay. Another quick question came up just from the guys watching. Just, is this a good time to invest in second property for like rental income? So, and I guess the larger question is, what's happening with property?
Oh, so Richard, these things are complex. So property is well priced, depending on which band you're buying in price-wise, and you can do well in property if you can live with the challenges of tenants and all the things that go with it, the pain and suffering, as I call it. It's certainly not the time to invest in property stocks. Property stocks, which predominantly invest in shopping centers and the like, I would say to you, it's not a good time to go there. I think we're going to see a lot more online than we are going to see foot traffic through the shop still. And so, yes, in the right context it is, but I would suggest you can do better in other fields with less pain.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe one last just quick question before we get to some deeper ones. You did mention this, but just on payment holiday options, I was quite encouraged to hear you say that you should go for those options if you can take them, because I was a little concerned about that myself, and there were these offers. And so you would still say that kind of across the board where you can take payment holidays?
Oh, definitely. You know, the tragedy is that what people really are struggling with in the main are cash flow. It's cash flow that's the issue. It's not the end game. It's trying to survive till the end. And so if you can buy yourself time and keep the policies, that's definitely the better option. And so yeah, I certainly would suggest the delay. You know, the payment holidays are a good option and create cash flow for you.
Okay, that's very helpful. Gary, so just on some sort of more sort of philosophical questions about things going on. I heard somebody say, just kind of a church podcast, and the podcast was about 7 major shifts that churches have to make and that people need to make in businesses. And one of them was just around the issue of generosity. And I like the one statement the guy was saying that this year, what we need to embrace is, he said, deep saving and deep generosity. Deep saving and deep generosity. And I thought that's really interesting, because it sounds like opposite. You know, you're either saving and hoarding or like giving it away. And I suppose it's kind of Luke 12, sort of the parable of the rich fool who hoarded it all up, you know. But kind of what would you say to that? Because that seems like a tension, you know. We got to put away, but got to give at the same time. How would you speak into people about that tension?
Yeah, Richard, it's a great question, and again, we could spend an evening on it. I think
Mm.
I think again, there's context. So I think it's wise for people to put money away for their retirement. I think it's wise to save. I think it's wise to have an emergency fund. If you've never had one of those, to have a bit of an emergency fund in your budget. I think those are wise things. But I also am aware that, particularly in a corporate environment, that there are people who are very blessed and who are very financially well positioned. Perhaps their houses are paid off and their cars are paid off, and they have more than they need. And to me, that's why I say be the church. The challenge is not just for those who are being tested because things are tough. The challenge for me, and I hope those that are financially well positioned or blessed, I hope they see the challenge that God is calling on those people. This is your time to shine. This is your time to love your neighbor, to love your brother, and to give more. So, generosity for me, both in kind, in money, in time, to encourage those. It's not just monetarily, but to be an encouragement to people. No, it's definitely a time. If there ever was a time of need, this country has lots of needs, but in the church itself, the Bible makes it very clear that we are to love each other, in a sense more. And so we were totally blown away at Honey Ridge when we opened up this care fund. I must tell you, I literally get a message from our bookkeeper, Kate, saying to me, "Oh, we got 150,000 in this month," and I nearly fell off my chair. It's just not something that we expected, and shame on us. But the church has rallied, and people have literally said to us, "When the fund runs out of money, tell me, and I'll put more in." That's been the attitude, and that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's doing the work the church is called to do.
Yeah, I agree. I think I was saying this yesterday. I think just for me, one of the most distinctive features of Christianity these days will be generosity, like in this kind of attitude of hoarding and fear. Like it'll really mark us and shine a light. But it is more difficult to do that now because of our own fears. So that is the challenge. Maybe a follow-up question just on that. So with regards to savings, so I was always taught, my dad, and then even when I was at previous church, kind of it seemed like a similar principle, like a certain amount of months of sort of your overhead running costs in the bank. So 3 months was kind of generally the wisdom that I had been taught, kind of in your personal life, and then in churches. What would you say? A, do you have like a rule of thumb there? And B, has that changed? Would you say to people, if you've got to dip into those savings now and contract that, you can?
Yeah, Richard. So without giving anything away, one of the new digital banks in town has done a lot of research on this. And they back tested 5 years of data on a sample of 1,000 clients. And were found that the average is about 3 months. It depends on your time in your life in terms of whether you have kids. It depends whether you have medical aid. Depends whether whether you have debt or not. In essence, it's not so much 3 months salary, but it's what they call 3 month coverage. So you have to sit down and say, how much of my money do I spend every month just that I have to spend? So like my example, not DSTV and all those things, but essentials, food, water, lights and rates, etc. What is that number times 3? And I should have that in an emergency account, and pretend it's not there, because if I get into trouble, it gives me time. And in fact, there are 2 theses in Oxford University on this exact topic, and there's lots of crazy ways to do it. FNB have got a wonderful thing called pocket change, that every time you spend money, instead of getting the change, you round it up to the nearest rand and they put it in an account and you build up that amount of money. I think it's very cool. So yes, fully support an emergency account. It's a luxury. This is not the time to do it if you haven't done it. This is the time that you might need it. But should it be in our planning, in terms of managing our finances in a God-honoring way? I think it should be.
And for churches, Gary, like what would you advise in terms of that?
So at Honey Ridge, I've implemented the same thing. We have 6 months cover for the church, and we keep that money aside as a buffer, and that's salaries, all our municipal costs, and and any licensing and stuff, that number times 6, and we keep that as a buffer. And that's actually a policy, a written down policy in the finance ministry, that we keep that buffer in place all the time, because we honestly feel it would be very unfair if the church got into difficulties that the staff weren't at least given some time to adapt or make a plan. So 6 months is what we've chosen.
Oh, that's hard. That's great. Maybe just on that then, with church finance views, you've obviously sat on a lot of church finance committees, and kind of as I have as well, and kind of the interesting tension is always, on the one hand, it's this faith that God will provide, and so you've got to spend and do, not hoard. So faith that God will provide on the one hand, and then on the other hand is kind of the adage of being good stewards, which is often a more conservative approach. So there's these kind of two approaches and this great tension. Is there any way that you guys talk about that, or any language or any axioms that you have to navigate that tension?
Yeah, but God, I think I'm quite a taskmaster when it comes to budgets and stuff, and can I just say to you, and I actually wrote some of them down for tonight in case you asked this question. There are a lot of obvious things that we become complacent about in churches, because we're trying to be nice. And so, ministries that no one's really thought through and brought to a head, things like one church that I got involved in their finances, they had a garden service. And when they got into trouble, simply by doing away with the garden service, it took pressure off them for the next 2 months while they sorted things out. Things like telephones accounts, cell phone accounts where staff have a cell phone, unnecessary capex where we make things last longer in a climate like this. I'm going to give you a ridiculous example of how expenses, and this is not a church example, this was just what I read in the Financial Mail. There's a corporate in South Africa that has a coffee shop in its head office, and they order coffee into their boardrooms. Nice coffee. A lot of the younger guys, Richard, you probably qualify for that still. You would say, don't give me coffee unless you give me decent coffee, right? And the word instant doesn't come into the discussion. But they found that they actually were spending 100,000 Rand a month on coffee, to their horror. Now, that's not very difficult when you've got 20, 30 boardrooms running and you're spending 30 Rand a cup of coffee. But the point I'm trying to make is, it's where are you spending money? What can, where your contracts. I'm going to make another comment, and please, this is not aimed at Rosebank. I know you guys well enough that I know this. You guys you strive for excellence, and I encourage that. But in times of difficulties, excellence sometimes comes at a price, and we mustn't be too proud to sometimes sacrifice a bit of excellence for a bit of savings. And at Honey Ridge, we've done that. So we've toned down one or two things, and we said we would like it to be better, but to run that costs an extra 20 grand a month, and we've toned it down and said, for now, excellence is a luxury in that context. That was the discussion around some equipment, and that's what we did. And so just putting it out there, I'll give you another one. Our armed response company, we engaged them. We have a permanent security guard at our church, and we got them down 20 grand. I think it's 26 grand for the year. Dare I suggest that this is quite a sensitive one, but we're very sensitive when to our missionaries when the Rand weakens, but we never knock on their door when it strengthens. I'm certainly in the camp to say, if the things are tight at the church, chat to the missionaries and say, do you need all this money right now, or are you willing to work with us? Can you? If they can't, that's fine. But sometimes they say, you know what, we're actually doing okay. Reduce it for a month or two. I think we do need to trust God, but we need to use the wisdom He's given us as well. And so, in a sense, use the wisdom that He's given you. Honor Him by doing things orderly and just asking yourself questions. Do we have needs or wants? Are there things in the church where we've done it and we're saying, well, yeah, we wanted that, or did we need it? And there's some things that maybe social pressure, maybe culture, maybe church politics, whatever you want to call it. But there's some things, where you would say to yourself, actually, we don't need this in our building, whatever it is. It's nice, we like it, but we don't need it. And right now, I'd rather not have this and be able to pay salaries. So we trust God, but we also use the wisdom that He's given us. And I think there is a point where we trust Him. But then I would say to you, as the senior pastor at Rosebank, and I know this is close to your heart, and you said you preached on it yesterday. I heard you say earlier, but we as elders need to challenge ourselves and the congregation and say, these are the needs. We've examined them, and this is where we've cut. And now we need to ask you to give, and not just the church to have faith, as in the elders and the staff, but the congregants to take on their responsibility and to have that same faith and trust God for the provision for them to give.
Giving me a lot to think about there, Gary. I feel like you did your homework on me with the coffee comments. That is a necessity on my side of the spectrum, but
yes, Tim, I didn't say coffee.
No, and thank you. I'm going to think a lot about that. Excellence is a luxury. I'm going to debate that with the team tomorrow, but thank you. Maybe just a couple of quick ones as well that have come from the floor. So one, just what's your take on medical insurance if you can't afford medical aid?
Yeah, look, I think it's about making sure that you don't get negatively impacted financially. So if you have a plan that pays for you, often the insurance is very narrow, and whereas a medical aid is a little wider. To be honest with you, in all of these things, you want to buy yourself choice. So when you get sick, you want to be able to go to as best an institution to get as best help as you can. I think there's very few people, no matter where they are in life, no matter where they are economically, who wouldn't agree they wouldn't all like to go to a private hospital. And so if you can afford that, I think that's optimal. I love gap insurance. I think it's a great product. If that's part of the question, it really works. But this is about negating risk. If you've got a good medical aid, you don't actually need as big a buffer in terms of your emergency fund.
Okay, thanks, Gary. I think we've got time for two more questions. So one that came from the floor. Can you give us some insight into the rest of Africa's economy and perhaps the attitude that we should have as South Africans to this?
Wow. Okay, that's a big one. So the truth is that outside of one or two countries in Africa, the powerhouses, the truth is that Africa is struggling, and economically poverty is rampant. Corruption is the norm in many places, and so our burden for poverty and for people living below the breadline, as well as the poverty, the consequences of poverty, lack of medical care, and the like, as Christians, has to be there. I wrestled with this for a number of years, and in fact, Pastor Harold Twine in our church helped me. You'll know that he does these trips to Zimbabwe, these missions of mercy, and one of the trips that he does is to a children's hospital, and he takes up supplies, and I've just been amazed how that specific focus has been a blessing to those folk who've given, who've gone, and to the hospital, and in a sense, Pastor Lee once preached a sermon at Honey Ridge saying, God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He doesn't need you, but you need to need him and to align to his purposes. And so in my mind, we need to pick and seek how we can please God as individuals and to have a ministry there. I know Rosebank's got some focus areas. You can't do it all. So we need to find those areas where we can be most effective, and we need to do it well and to God's glory. And I think that's what we can do. That we should have a burden for Africa is without question. Economically, unfortunately, the road is long. And, from a Christian point of view, we can't solve their economic woes. We can pray for salvation and for change of hearts, which should lead to integrity in leaders, which should lead to better governments.
Okay, Gary, one last question. It was something that I heard early on in the pandemic, and you actually mentioned it before we started, just backstage. I think you said the Don't waste the crisis. So one of the lines that I heard that was so helpful to us at Rosebank is that with this crisis or any crisis, there comes a clarifying and catalyzing potential. In other words, it really just helps clarify your thoughts on things and some decisions we had to make, difficult decisions last year, and catalyzing it catalyzes things you probably should have done a long time ago. So in terms of like our finances, I know you spoke a bit about this, cutting out some of the things that are wants and not needs. But anything else you want to say, maybe just as a last encouragement on that, on how to not waste this crisis from a financial view in your own life?
Okay, it's a lovely question. So, Richard, I have to say to you, and the testimony I gave to your congregation a while ago at your request was a crisis in my life as well, a work crisis that I had. I have learned not to see crises as negative. I've learned that, in a sense, it's like there's lots of biblical examples how the word's been learned through affliction, right down to Jonah and the whale. But we must embrace this. This is not, in a sense, when we look back, we must be pleased with how we've served the Lord in this. And so, for me, it's about a spiritual experience, and that goes into finances. It goes into my walk with the Lord. It goes into how I love people. But in a sense, and I'll give you the example. We might look at Zimbabwe, and let's take Central Baptist Church in Harare when John Bell was there. And he'll tell you that he has electricity 3 times a week and he has water twice a week. And we'll go, whoa, Lord, please don't call me to that. And yet he will also tell you that he has never seen so much spiritual growth amongst a congregation in his life. And can I say to you, maybe we need this. Before you throw stones, we don't need the virus, and please God, take it away at some stage. But maybe we need to refocus. Maybe we need to stop being Joburg money or possession-centered, mindseted people. And maybe we need to stop and smell the roses, and we need to focus on the Lord and his purposes more intently. And we need to step back a little bit. And in that same context, we need to, is it necessary to trade that car in and get a new one, or should I rather give money to a mission vision that's going to last the next 3 years for somebody to go and do something, or something in Africa? We're not like that. I'm not sure about Rosebank, but certainly the Honey Ridge profile is we have that normal January flutter of new cars that come into the car park as people hit 5 years and change cars. And I'm not against buying new cars, please. I'm just using an example. But what I'm trying to say to you is, don't miss this opportunity, this so-called crisis. I want to turn around and say to you, we shouldn't call it a crisis. We should call it an opportunity, and we should see it as a time that the Lord can use to speak into corners of our lives that he normally wouldn't be able to speak into, because our hearts are hard and we are so focused on everything around us. I was saying to my wife, Sandra, this last week, it's actually caused me to stop and reassess a whole stack of things. And maybe one of them, just the fact that the company I work for in the last 2 weeks has had 14 deaths, for example, which is tragic. Staff deaths, that's tragic. And I have no doubt a number of companies have had this. But it's very real when you know some of those people. And they were healthy people, perhaps healthier than I am. And so you stop and you say to yourself, what am I doing? This crisis is causing me to stop and say, how am I, just this tonight's discussion, what am I doing with my money? Am I being generous enough? Am I being kind enough? Am I being sensitive? Am I really open to the leading of the Spirit in hearing somebody's needs? And the other side of this is, am I placing enough faith in God to provide for my needs where I need it? But dare I suggest, not wasting the crisis is, I said this to our Honey Ridge elders 2 weeks ago in our meeting. We must stop being reactive to this thing and trying to wish it away, and can't wait for the president, and I know he's talking to us just now, for another family meeting where he allows us to go and do all the things we want to do. In a sense, there's a tragedy in the relaxation, because then we'll go back to our old ways. So my encouragement is, don't waste the crisis. Embrace it as an opportunity to allow God to speak. And in a sense, look for what he wants you to learn in this thing. Sorry, I'm not articulating it very well, but for me, it's been a spiritual journey, and it's taken a while. I've been quite close to this, but I've literally in the last little while suddenly realized God has a purpose in this too for me, and so my desire is to find out. I've got to love Him. That's my mandate under Romans 8:28. But I've got to find out what pleases God, and within His purposes, what's my role in this? He didn't change His purposes because this came along. He has purposes in this too. And so both in the church and for us individually. Sorry, I'm not sure if that's helpful.
No, you articulated that very well, Gary, and I think that is just the perfect place to end. So thank you so much. Just especially that last part was just so golden for us. I think just seeing the comments and stuff, that just really was very impactful. So Gary, just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for giving us just an hour of your time. We really appreciate that. Please thank your wife, Sandra, and your family as well. We will, I think, sign off shortly and see what the president says. But I think, we're not going to hold on to that.
No.
Right about that. So, thank you so much. This has been really helpful, Gary.
Thank you for having me.
Time with us, and to you, Rosebank people, and anyone else who's watching. Just thank you for joining us tonight as well. As we navigate these difficult times and not wanting to miss what God is saying and what God is doing in our lives. So we hope that you join us as we carry on with this rule of life. And next week, this coming Sunday, we talk about just time and busyness and hurry and that Joburg lifestyle that Gary spoke about. So we're going to push a little bit more into that. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Thank you one last time to Gary. Hope you all have a really good evening and hope to see you in person sometime soon, but if not, online. Good night, everybody.
Good night. God bless.